Great, well thank you so much for being here. And can you hear me okay?
Yes.
That is awesome. Thanks to Chris who's recording this for us, and welcome to the Institute for Family Studies. I'm really excited that Lyman is here because Lyman is a hugely fascinating person with a lot to say and a huge authority to say it, and is going to be a big name if he isn't already. So you got to see him here first in this intimate audience. But he's and then we were excited to discover that you have tweeted or posted 195,500 times in the time that you've been on Twitter, which apparently works out as a rate of 44 posts or reposts a day.
That seems.
So this is.
But that's divided by 7. I usually don't tweet on weekends. So
that's why everyone is here today.
No, if it were really an intervention, Brad would be here because I think the person who has told me the most times in my life, Lyman, you should really consider that tweet a little more, is Brad Wilcox. So, okay. And he's usually right.
Well, we're doing him next week. But just as we are friends, Michael has said that you're from Kentucky, but you're not. Is that where you were from? Is that where you've always been? But it's not where you've always lived.
It's not where I've always lived. But yeah, so I mean, I'm born and raised from Kentucky. The fun thing about Kentucky and the Shenandoah is the towns all have the same names and they're the same last names. So it's basically the same place, except your mountains are a bit farther apart than ours. So yeah, I'm from Kentucky, but did 5 years in DC, first at a think tank, then I was a Fed for the USDA Foreign Agricultural Service, where I was basically a cotton spy. So my job was to spy on other countries' cotton production. So it's like whatever the lowest rung of the intelligence community is, it is I. They give you a top secret clearance and you're like, so what secrets am I going to deal with? And they're like, you're never going to deal with secrets. You just have to be able to log into like the official like State Department email system. So I did that for a while, and then.
What is the best cotton secret you know?
You know, at this point, it's not secret anymore because the job was actually to publish reports that revealed all of these secrets. So it's really like an underwhelming secret job. But it wasn't secret. It was public what the job was. But I got to like spy on fun satellite images and things like that, and go places that I wouldn't vacation. From there, my wife and I moved to Hong Kong. She taught full-time in a local school, and I transitioned to doing full-time consulting with demographic intelligence and focusing on writing more on demography generally. We were there 2 years, then we moved to Montreal where I began my PhD and continued all the demography stuff. So we were there 4 years, and we have just returned to God's favorite Commonwealth about a year ago, and are close to family for our family.
That's fantastic. So that's quite the switch, though, from cotton to just slipping in demographic international. So how did that come about? Why are you interested in this topic of demography?
I drew the short straw. When I worked for Tax Foundation, a nonpartisan tax policy think tank, I was the new guy. I was young. I was still in grad school, and they said, "You look like you want to write on the topics nobody else wants to." And so I was assigned the question of how do taxes influence interstate migration? Okay, so I was in grad school, so I was like, okay, I'm just going to fill my electives with courses on migration. That was interesting. I did that. When I left that job and moved to USDA, federal workers are not overworked. They have some time on their hands. Sometimes they watch YouTube, play video games. I was like, I'm going to start a blog totally unrelated to agriculture. And so I started writing about migration, then regional economic development. Then I noticed if I wrote about population, there were like more clicks on those articles. So I thought, that's interesting. And then finally I was like, at one point I was just looking up fertility things, and I was like, it looks like all of the lines are going down. That feels like it could be a bad thing. And I wrote something about this saying, has anyone else noticed the lines? They're all going down. And it blew up, and I thought, okay, fertility. Now, I didn't know a lot about it, so I kind of self-taught myself a lot of the quantitative demography skills, which is why I later went to do a PhD, because I realized there were gaps I needed to actually be taught. At some point, you have to accept the limits of your knowledge. But what really happened there is I realized there was an area where the quality of public discourse was low. That quite frankly, the people writing in this area were not, the people writing about the issue as an issue of concern were not people who could actually make a respectable argument to the people whose job it was to be experts in the area. There were plenty of people worried about low fertility. None of them could actually do the quant side of the job of a demographer. And I realized I could. And at the same time, I realized this was an area where, unlike cotton commodity market analysis or what in these other things, I could do something that would feed my family and use my skills and also give me opportunities to advocate things deeply consonant with my values.
And that was about how many years ago?
2017.
So very recently, really.
Yeah, within the last 10 years.
A meteoric rise to one of the world's most famous demographers.
I will say, when I applied to the PhD program at McGill, my advisor recognized my name because she said, "Oh, I assigned some of the things you've written in my class." And I said, "Oh, really? I'm so glad that my work's respected." She was like, "No." She's like, I assigned it as an example of like possibly toxic public rhetoric about fertility. So then when I was her TA, it was this, I did this thing where like, I wrote an article on one side of the debate, somebody else wrote one on the other side. And so then when I was a TA for her class, we assigned, the students they don't pay attention to the TA's name when they meet me on the first day. So we assigned both things to the students and had them then write responses. And then she had me come in and like give a talk afterwards. And they were like, "Oh, our TA is the author of the thing." So it caused some consternation.
Well, so talking about toxic public rhetoric, what is the problem? What is going on with demography and the decline in the fertility rate?
It's going down. So in 2007, the average woman turning 15 in America could expect to have 2.1 kids. That number 2.1 we conventionally call replacement rate, which means if there's no change in people's odds of kicking the bucket, if there's no migration in or out, that is approximately going to create a stable population in the long run. So that's where we were in 2007. Today we're at 1.6. We are not the only country to have that decline. Our decline is a bit bigger than average. Korea is 0.65. They were 1.3. Most of the world, their big decline began around 2010. We started things early because America leads. Fertility's falling. And at first, demographers said maybe people are just delaying when they get started, but they'll catch up later. We now know that's not true. We can see in cohorts as they're aging and in various fancy math methods we have to deal with timing changes that no, really, people are never going to have as big of a family as they would have if things had stayed as they were in the early 2000s. This decline, the public has lacked for a compelling explanation that is widely understood. That's a circuitous way of saying it's that I think I know why it's declining, but that we have not yet captured the public imagination with that explanation.
Yeah, now I know that when I asked you about this a couple of weeks ago, I think you'd cited that figure of 1.6. And yeah. Being from England, I stopped doing math at the age of 16. So I had to ask Lyman, well, what does that mean, 1.6? And what does it mean in terms of a reduction per?
So if 2.1 is replacement and 1.6 is where we are, that means there's two different ways I like to think about this. One, you can say every woman is, and I should also say the average American woman says she wants between 2.2 and 2.7 kids, okay? So the average woman is missing half to a whole child versus what she wants for herself. Now, if you're the half of a child that's missing, it's a bit awkward. But so that's one way to think about this. It's basically every other woman is missing a child versus 2007, and she's basically missing basically every woman is missing a child versus what she wants. The other way to think about this is generationally, which is we will lose 25% of the size of each generation. Each generation will be 25% smaller than the prior one in terms of their biological children. Of course, there's a bit of nudging around immigration and things like that. So I think those are two different ways to think about that. One, the individual thing of just how many people have the ghost of a child in their mind. And then also socially. The pace of decline, when you think about it that way, it can be quite stark.
So we're told that there's too many people on the planet anyway, and that there are obviously some people who are curtailing the number of children that they have because they're worried about the planet. But is it good for the planet to have a reduction in the population in terms of like being able to feed everybody?
No. This honestly, I'm sympathetic to a lot of. To be honest, I'm sympathetic to some of the we could say somewhat left of center climate arguments that I think I want my children to inherit a healthy planet, and we have not always been on course to be able to pass that on to them. But the reality is, it just is not the case that lowering fertility alters or reduces climate emissions. In fact, we can go back, we can test this. We can say, okay, 50 years ago, did countries that adopted more draconian climate policy or fertility policies have lower carbon emissions over the last 50 years? No. In fact, they had faster growth in carbon emissions. There's like 7 or 8 countries that were early adopters of fertility suppression policies. And they had vastly higher growth in carbon emissions. Now, I'm going to say that's because of fertility policies. Mostly they had differences in the kind of industrial policies they pursue. There are other confounding factors. But beyond that, we can just ask, like, let's say you're a family in Kenya. And everybody in Kenya, childless is very low. Everybody's going to have a first kid. And you're debating a second kid. Well, what happens when you have a second kid? With the first kid, maybe mom keeps working because it's a poor society and subsistence needs are great, and she's going to keep tending the family cattle herd no matter what. But the second kid, what happens? Well, she can't work as much. There's just too much stuff to do, which means income falls, okay? And we know this is a motherhood penalty. When you have kids, they don't come with a check attached. They come with a small check, the child tax credit, but they don't come with a big enough check. Your family income falls, your consumption falls. What causes carbon emissions? Consumption. So what happens to a family's footprint when they have a baby? Well, unfortunately, their incomes tend to fall. Okay, but from a carbon perspective, fortunately, their consumption tends to fall. Also, what do? You switch what you consume. You switch from airplane tickets and wine to diapers and childcare. Now, on the for-profit side, the diaper companies are my clients, so I am paid to say that diapers have lower carbon emissions per dollar spent than airplane tickets. But it is really true. They actually do. The things you buy for babies are very low carbon emissions. So there's actually a substitution in household consumption. Finally, the other thing is, I think the most important, the technology to conclusively solve climate change does not currently exist. We can do a lot, but we're not quite there. We need more minds to do it. I'm not a world-class genius. I'm not going to invent a breakthrough technology. Those people are rare. Your odds of getting them are very low, and you need thousands of them. To get that, you need a lot of babies born, because it's just a roll of the dice every time. Are you going to get one of these crazy smart people or not? So every inventor that's born benefits all of humanity, right? One person with 150 IQ is a gift to the entire species. We want to maximize the raw number of such people to tackle climate change or any other innovation problem, going to Mars, whatever it is. You need just a lot of really smart brains. One Elon Musk does a lot. So we need to maximize births, in fact, to solve long-run challenges.
I'm just going to push a little bit, because you talked about you have for-profit clients, and obviously the more people there are, the more you can sell things to. But if we do have a decline in population, does it not create different products or different markets? Is there still not a frontier that is created?
Yeah. So I have one client that produces diapers. They produce diapers for babies. They produce feminine hygiene products, the Kotex brand. And they also produce Depends. So as population ages, the forecast products that they ask me to produce switch. They're saying, well, maybe we don't need to buy your baby diaper forecast as much, but we'd really like an adult incontinence forecast. So yeah, new products emerge, but on the whole, less demand is less demand. If there's just fewer people producing things of value, we are all poorer. And it's not just, people think of things in terms of like the size of the pie. I hate the pie metaphor, but to go with the pie metaphor, pies have a size like this, okay, and a depth, okay? You can have your thin crust pizza. Let's go with pizza instead. You can have your thin crust pizza or your deep dish. I'm a deep dish person, okay? I like a very thick pizza. Population is not just changing like the total number of people in society. The more people there are, you get more really high potential people. You also get more opportunities to exchange. It's hard to find a spouse when you only have 4 other people your same age and 2 of them are your cousins. Okay? And you can see this in the human genetic record from thousands of years ago, because you can look at people's genes, you can see how closely related their parents are. People were way more likely to be inbred when population was low, thousands of years ago, when we were all hunter-gatherers in small bands hunting mammoths and such. People were inbred, and it had bad consequences on their ability to function as people and as a civilization, and a lot of them died prematurely as a result. Now, we're not on the edge of becoming like a systematically inbred species, but the point is, the more people we have around us, the more opportunities we have for collaborative exchanges. The generation of new ideas scales exponentially with the number of nodes that are in an idea-generating network. It's just basic economies of innovation.
Yeah. So I think we've established then that it is something of an issue, and well, I think my other question was like, so it's in terms of the declining rate. So if we were to accept any sort of decline,
what would happen?
Is there an acceptable rate of decline? Like, does it have to be a replacement rate?
Yeah. I don't care actually about replacement rate. I care about what people say they want. So if somebody tells me I want 0 kids, then I want them to have 0 kids. There's many reasons for that. One is because fundamentally I think we have to be committed to accepting people's right to make choices for their own lives. Now, we can have rules about how they achieve 0 and what technologies are acceptable to be used to stay at 0. Abortion obviously is not one that maybe would be universally accepted. But I also happen to know that when people who don't want kids have a child, that child's odds of dying before 5 are astronomically higher. That's a problem, right? Now, on the other hand, I know that if somebody says they want 3 kids, and let's say I ask a 17-year-old, how many kids do you want? They say 3. I know if I follow up with them when they're 40 and they have only 1 child, that their odds of reporting symptoms of clinical anxiety and depression are much higher than a demographically similar person who said they wanted 3 and had 3. Why do I know that? Because we have longitudinal surveys where we've done this. We also know if you look at people going in for IVF, and this isn't an endorsement of IVF, but it's a wonderful scientific opportunity because, see, everybody going in for IVF wants kids. Nobody is like, I don't want kids, here's $40,000 for IVF. Everybody wants kids if they're getting IVF. Some people succeed, some people fail, some people succeed quickly, some people don't succeed very quickly. In some countries, privacy laws are very lax for researchers, namely Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland. And so researchers can say, okay, you went in for IVF, you had a baby 9 months later, or you didn't, you had one 2 years later, or you never had another baby. And by the way, I can also see every other drug you were ever prescribed. So I can see if you're prescribed antidepressants. So a woman's odds of being prescribed antidepressants rise in proportion to how long it takes for IVF to succeed, especially if it doesn't. Which is to say, when people say they want kids, they mean it, and if they don't get it, it hurts them. So we can talk a lot about the consequences of falling fertility. Oh, it'll threaten Social Security. Correct, it will. The Social Security checks will not clear without babies. We can talk about Medicare. We can talk about long-run economic growth, innovation. But fundamentally, people are miserable when they do not get the lives they desire for themselves.
So why is this happening in the United States then? What's going wrong here?
Everybody always says, well, if they want kids, I know how to make them. They could just have them, right? Well, it takes two to tango. I mean, now, of course, you can buy a sperm donor, but the reality is almost nobody wants to have a child. They want the experience of being a parent and raising a child. These are radically different things. The whole, you could just have a child if you wanted one. Or, kids aren't that expensive. You can just be Amish. Okay? It's true, you can. You can go off the grid. People do it. But the reality is what people want is not merely to know that two versions of half of their DNA exist in the world. What people want is the psychological and social experience of raising a child, having a family, being a parent in a certain socially normative script. And that script almost universally involves marriage. And I know people are like, but people have kids out of wedlock out all the time. Not typically because it was their first ideal for their life. Why do we know this? Because we just ask people in surveys. With IFS, we did a survey where we just asked people, here's 6 life transitions, marrying, having babies, put them in the order you think they should happen in your life. Almost everyone, like 90% of respondents, put marriage before baby. Even people who had, and we knew these women's fertility histories from the survey, even people who had babies before getting married said marriage should come before babies. Now, there was a bit more disagreement about some other life course things like buying a house or having sex or moving in together, but marriage before baby is an almost universal preference. It's what people want for themselves, even if they don't get it. And marriage rates are collapsing in the US. Conditional on being married, fertility rates in the US have not fallen very much. People who get married at a given age, if you look at people who get married at age 27, their odds of having a first child, a second child, a third child at certain ages haven't declined very much. Just not much change. What's happened is people are not coupling. And so almost the entire decline in fertility in the US is driven by reduced odds of people going from 0 to 1 child and a little bit from 1 to 2. A woman of a given age who has 3 children has seen no decline in her odds of going on to 4. A woman with 4 has seen no decline in her odds of going on to 5. The problem of pronatalism is not a problem of vanishing big families. And often that's what we think it is. We're like, oh, pronatalism, big families. And I want a big family. I only have 3, but we want many more. I know we probably have big families in the room, which is wonderful. I'm very in favor of big families. But fundamentally, the problem is missing first babies, and to some extent second.
Now, it's because people are getting too rich, that's why they're not having babies?
You've baited me. He knows that I've just published 2 articles on IFS's website on this, and I have a 3rd and kind of a 4th in the pipeline. The 4th is because a section of the 3rd got deleted, and now I have to do it as a 4th. I have good editors who tell me I'm too long-winded. And he's looking at the timer like, yeah, we're not going to get to all of our questions. So yes, it's not because people got rich. We actually know, and I won't belabor this, you can read about it on the website if you want more. We actually know what happens when people get more money. When a society gets more money, they have more babies. And I know that's like, oh, but Africa has more babies and they're poor. The main cause of different fertility rates across countries is not their income level. Nepal and France have the same fertility rate, okay? The main cause of different fertility rates in different countries is different cultural norms. And cultural norms partly spread through access to technology and media spaces that are enabled by income, but they don't only spread through those channels. Cultural norms are the things that explain the massive yawning differences in fertility around the world. Income, when economic times are good, people have babies. When economic times are bad, they don't. It's that simple. And you can see this in numerous cases around the world that I've graphed in meticulous detail in charts that have been made lovely by IFS's brand new branding or rebranding. So the next one will have lovely charts.
We're looking forward to it. We love your charts. So what does that mean for poorer families in America?
Almost the entire decline in fertility is driven by people, let's say, below the 75th percentile of income. The top 25% of Americans have seen very little decline in marriage and very little decline in fertility. So much so that whereas a generation or two ago, it was the case that less educated and poorer Americans had bigger families, that is no longer the case. It is actually the case now that wealthier Americans are having bigger families than poorer Americans, because the entire decline in marriage is occurring among poorer people.
Yeah, because of the marriage decline.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One of them is just marriage penalties. We have large and growing marriage penalties, particularly aimed at low-income people through means-tested programs, welfare programs.
Well, we can get on to policies in a few minutes, but I will shout out to our research director, Dr. Wendy Wang, who's in the audience. And she's came up with an amazing chart that showed a marriage divide, and I think it's something like 77% of households earning over $111,000 will be married in prime working age group. But as soon as that's under $50,000, it shrinks to 27%. So there's a huge marriage divide, and that didn't exist in the 1970s. So that's interesting that is driving our fertility crisis.
It's an enormous change.
So when it comes to a government, and we're going to get a new one soon, hip hip hooray. Did I let slip my government culture? On one hand, so some people complain about sort of pronatalism as a little bit fascist. And so what historical examples have there been of highly successful fascism? So I was looking around on this, and in Franco's Spain, he would award a prize annually, apparently, to the family that had the most children, with the largest number being 18 children through one nuclear family, and that would have been pretty nuclear. But then there's Ceausescu on the other side. I wondered if we could look a little bit at government. Does it have to be a Ceausescu? I don't know if you want to explain a little about Ceausescu. Does it have to be Franco Ceausescu? Is there an alternative that we can do in the United States?
So again, the cruel editorial staff of the Institute for Family Studies deleted an entire multi-page digression from one of my reports about the experience of fascism and how it relates to fertility. No, it's the report was, in fairness, already 40 pages, but
what type of government culture can create pronatalism?
To be honest, pretty much any of them. There's no reason to believe that democratization is related to low fertility. And in fact, in big, multi-country models over time that have variables for all these sorts of things, I can tell you, there really is no identifiable effect of democracy levels or liberalism on fertility. And the classic example of this, one of the most democratic and liberal countries in Europe for much of, in continental Europe at least, for much of the 20th century was France. And they routinely had the highest fertility. That wasn't true in the 19th century. In the 19th century, France had by far the lowest fertility in Europe. They were the ones who started the demographic transition. In fact, they started in the mid-1700s. So it is true that some of the most famous pronatal policies were implemented by totalitarian regimes, such as Ceausescu's Romania, or Franco's Spain, or the most extreme case is literally the Nazis. Had a very quote-unquote successful pronatal program specifically for people who met their preferred racial prototype. Now, those policies are famous partly because if a dictator does it, it becomes famous. The biggest fertility increase in Europe in the last 15 years, anybody want to guess what country it was? Everybody says Hungary, but it wasn't Hungary. Czech! It's the Czechs! You've heard about their policies all over Fox News, right? No, you haven't. Because there's not a sexy political story. It's just both parties kind of did stuff. Kind of said, we should just help families more. So there's no political culture or political institutional set that has to be there for pronatalism, other than you need a broad political consensus that persuades families that whatever the government does do will stick. Nobody wants to commit to the, let's be honest, 30-year financial commitment of supporting a child if the government isn't going to keep that program in place for more than 4 years, right? We'd love to say it's an 18-year commitment, But then you look at the share of kids that are living with their parents when they're 30, and you're like, okay, it's a 30-year commitment. So like, we want to build an accessory dwelling unit for our house in our yard, and my wife was like, why do we need that? And I'm like, for a child eventually. So yeah, I mean, the point is you have to have a political culture that can convince families that whatever you are doing for family will be stable. It will be there when they need it. Families are not going to respond to a policy that is not going to be there when they need it.
You said earlier that culture is extremely important when it comes to pronatalism and then the script that people are operating under. So Elon Musk is saying that if there is 30 years of stable civilization, we should be able to get a city in Mars of 1 million people.
Terminus, right?
Well, yeah, I think it should be called Musco.
But I think he calls it Terminus. I think he already named it.
There should be something a little more open-ended. Do you think?
It feels dead end, right?
We're calling it pronatalism in part because pronatalism has taken Michael was saying earlier, has gripped the imagination of Silicon Valley. But when it comes to culture, there's this competing idea that pronatalism should take. So I think I read this week that Elon Musk is building a compound in Texas for his the various mothers of his children to be able to move in, so that they're sort of like close to him. Okay. So that seems to be, that's pronatalism of some sort. I mean, it might be going back to an earlier
it's a version of
culture. But is that sort of like polygamous, polyamorous culture? If that's one option, is the pronatalism initiative perhaps suggesting another? Yeah. Does it have to be trad wife culture and 6 families and a homestead? And perhaps one way of answering this question is, let's just have a blank slate. We're going to Mars. We're going to put 1 million people on there.
What culture prevails in the Mars colony?
What pronatalist culture should be on there? Should it be a 20th century American nuclear family one? Should it be something archaic and polyamorous to sort of like make sure? Should it be a bunch of IVF babies raised in the facility? Why does how we raise our children matter in a pronatalist context?
I will say polygamy is not the future. And the reason why is because it's not the past. People have this notion that humans moved out of an era of polygamy into the civilizing light of monogamy. That is not what happened. We know this because, again, we can look in ancient DNA and we can count how many actively reproductively successful Y chromosomes appear and how many mitochondrial lines appear. And we can see that in the primordial ancestral state for humans, we were pair-bonded breeders. That is, the ratio of mitochondrial lines to Y lines, so men to women, is comparatively balanced. It is not until essentially a bit before, basically the end of the last ice age, but before agriculture, you start to see the rise of what looks to be polygamy. And then particularly with the advance of a series of war-making technologies in the Bronze Age, you get this epic expansion where like the number of reproductively successful female lines is like 25 times the number of successful Y DNA lines, which implies the massive polygamy. And you see this, you get like kings of Babylon who report like 250 wives and 5,000 children or something. But the point is, this was like a very brief episode of the human story that emerged because of a bizarre kind of military situation, and we're not going back to, because it's maladaptive. It didn't produce like wildly good things. The civilizations that stuck with it lost. Basically, the Romans ate them for lunch. And the Romans, of course, were aggressively monogamous. So the reason I think we're not going to be polygamous in the future is because we are quite literally biologically pair bonders. We optimally sort into long-term, not always lifelong, but long-term marital unions. It is true that polygamy has existed in the majority of documented historic human societies, but there's almost no society in all of human history where a majority of unions were polygamous. So it's just not going to be the future. the future is going to be some version of monogamy. It's going to be some version of loving parents raising their biological children. There will always be exception cases, there will be things on the margin, but that's how most people are going to live and raise their kids. And that's where most of future human genetic material is going to come from. And so that being the case, it is really, it might not be identical to mid-20th century American nuclear families. It may vary in certain ways. The historic norm was that men and women both worked full-time as subsistence farmers. I don't know, our work arrangements may vary. But the future is absolutely not going to be, polyamorous scientists, having, full genetic mix in a test tube, and that. No, it's just not going to happen. And then also people wonder about artificial wombs, and I'm skeptical on them, both on the scientific technology side, but also the reality is the main cost of kids is, and I say this without any disrespect to the very real work that mothers do gestating children, but overwhelmingly the dominant social and resource cost of reproduction is raising the child. Mm-hmm. And so even in the case where adoption is highly subsidized, you don't see people, very many people, adopting massive numbers of children. A few families do, for mostly religious reasons. So it just, raising the kids is what costs a lot. So you're not going to get a situation where everybody's like, well, I'm just going to have them grow in an artificial womb and raise 47 children. No, you're not.
Well, thank you, Lyman. This has been like a fascinating sweep through history, time, and space, and you've given us a headline there, which is great too. So I appreciate that. Polygamy is not the future because it's not the past. We're going to close out there, but I just wonder if, in the remaining 60 seconds that we have, bringing us back to the United States of the Earth and today, if there was one policy that, in the blitzkrieg of the incoming government, that they're attacking a whole load of different policy issues, but if there was the one thing that they could do to boost pronatalism in the United States?
Yeah, well, we published 5 on the website. So you're really constraining. See, the editorial staff at IFS, they're always censoring me. Elon, save me. No. Marriage penalties. It's marriage penalties. We have so many marriage penalties baked into so many policies. We have policies that are good. Things like the EITC, which is a good policy, encouraging work and encouraging people to get out of poverty through work rather than dependency. That's great. And yet, we literally bake like a multi-$1,000 marriage penalty into it. If you marry a guy who's in prison, you keep your whole EITC. But if you marry a guy with a job, you lose it. This is perverse and wicked, frankly. Fixing it is a bit tricky and involves, depending on how you fix it, can be expensive. But we also just have cultural barriers to fixing it. I was explaining this to someone.
Well, maybe we can explore this in questions.
Sure, yes.
So, well, thank you so much, Lyman. That has been awesome. I do want to give the opportunity for some questions, and it is an informal group, so we can just shout out. I'll assume that no question is for me. I mean, is that right? Okay, so they're all going to be for Lyman. And we'll start at the back there. We'll take one at a time.
The question was about the importance of happiness, and does sort of a hopeful or joyful or happy or optimistic outlook associate with fertility? And the answer is yes. The strongest variable to predict the number of kids that people have is the number they say they want. The second strongest is not their religiosity. It is not their opinion of contraception. It's not how much they say they like having sex, though that one's pretty high. It is any measure of positive or negative affect. So sometimes what we have in a survey is like a short form questionnaire of symptoms of depression. Sometimes we've got like kind of a life satisfaction ladder. Sometimes we've got like expectations of the future. We've got different ways this gets measured. Happiness is extremely important. And there's a phenomenal study from the privacy violation countries, the Scandinavian countries, where they took the complete medical records of everyone in Sweden and Finland, as one does. And they said, okay, what predicts fertility from people's medical records? And like, obviously, the thing that most predicts not having babies, and they have a great method to get at causality. They compare siblings to each other. So people who are raised similarly, have similar DNA, but they look at people who get diagnosed with one condition or another, or a different one earlier in life in relation to kids. And they said, okay, what conditions most predict having way fewer kids? Number one is like congenital deformities. And I don't think that's shocking. I mean, these people are often living lives with lifelong impairments. The second is anything related to like mood and behavior. So mood and behavioral disorders. The most severe, like the particularly dramatic ones like schizophrenia, but even clinical diagnosis with common mood and behaviorals like general anxiety or major depressive also had serious negative effects. You see this in surveys. We wrote an article about this for IFS. I did maybe a year ago. Pull a survey, pick any country in the world. They've all got surveys. Either there's one called the Multiple Indicator Cluster Survey that often asks questions about happiness. And it also asks questions about maternal health and well-being and stuff. And like, roll a dice, pick a random developing country. I do a lot of work on Nepal for other reasons, so I looked at Nepal. And it does turn out that in Nepal, women with a more positive outlook are more likely to say that they expect to have kids in the next 2 years, that they expect to have more kids. That's true with any controls you drop on it. Same thing happens when we run surveys for IFS in the US. Women with more positive affect expect to have more kids, want to have more kids, and do have more kids. So the mental health crisis is a serious issue. So like, if you want to know like one low-key pronatal policy, it's like install cell phone jammers at every school. Michael's like, we should do legislation, and I'm like, pirate cell phone jammers. More responsible policy. That's why I'm not on the tech and family beat. I'm like, how do we get babies? How do we make these kids socialize with each other?
I think we have time for one more answer.
Oh my God, I'm so long-winded.
Yeah. Jerry.
Yeah, my name is Jerry McDermott. From what I read, the countries of Europe, for example, not to mention Korea and Japan, with these abysmally low birth rates.
Yep.
And they're all concerned about it. And they've been doing things for years trying to get women to have babies, and it's not working. And Hungary is a good example. Orban is totally pronatal, and he's had program after program after program, and the Hungarian birth rate, from what I read, has not gone up. Secondly, I just have a little problem with the answer being government policy. Do we really want people to be dependent on the government for whether or not they have kids? And by the example of Europe, it's not working anyway.
Basically, a lot of countries have done a lot of things to try and get more babies, and it turns out they don't have that many babies. So why do pronatal policy if it doesn't work? So I would say two things. One, the policies do work. And what I mean by work is, in the case of Hungary, for example, I could go on about this a very long time. One of the problems is how we measure fertility. The typical measure we use, the total fertility rate, is a nice ad hoc sort of point-in-time estimator, but fundamentally it's wrong. It's really measuring when people have kids, not how many they have. When we use tempo-adjusted indicators, Hungary has had, my recollection is, the second biggest increase in fertility in Europe since they rolled out their policies. Number one, you can't beat Czechia. You just can't beat them. Unless you include Georgia in the mix, and Georgia's had an even bigger increase, and they did it through pronatal policy, explicitly. Now, in fairness, it was pronatal policy implemented through their state-sponsored church. But pronatal policy through a state church is pronatal policy. It's the government one way or another. So what we know from decades of research on this is if you throw money at the problem, you do get more babies. The problem is you run out of money before you get to the number of babies you want. You do get more babies. In fact, if you reduce the price of raising a child by about 1%, you get about 1% more babies, which means the economic elasticity of babies is about the same as hamburgers, which means people are price sensitive on kids. But the problem is a hamburger costs, well, now it's like $8. So people buy less of them. But babies cost, the USDA says $250,000 from 0 to 17. Of course, if you're actually supporting a child through 30, it's way more. And also, that's only budgetary costs. That is not opportunity costs of lost wages. And it's also not hedonic costs of all the time you spent when you could have done something else. IFS just ran an article by a great European demographer who argued that parents contribute something like 4 times as much after all the transfers, after subsidies and taxes, to long-term fiscal stability of welfare states as non-parents do. Which is to say, this gets to the second question, why the government? Because most of the benefits of kids are social, right? Parents get some benefit from having kids in that you get kids, okay? And that's great. I love my kids. One of my kids just fell and broke her arm 3 hours after I flew out of my house this morning. And I'm like so frustrated. I'm not there to comfort her because like comforting sick kids is one of the best parts of being a parent. When you know they'll heal. Obviously it's not if they're not going to heal. Then it's the worst part. But at the end of the day, like your touchy-feelies about your kid are not the reason the government might deeply care unless your touchy-feelies are part of a deep mental health problem that we care about in terms of having a less miserable society. What the government cares about is the long-term social welfare of society, which depends on children. And parents are taking these enormous social costs to raise these children who pay for retirement of people who didn't have kids. Those people shouldn't be getting anything. Not just Social Security. Why should you be allowed to sell stock? The people buying it are just younger people you didn't bear. Now, I don't mean that literally. Obviously, that would be insane. But fundamentally, all of society depends on the work of raising children. There is no more essential task. It is the center point of human civilization. Parents are the sole load-bearing beam there, and the returns to that are diffused throughout all of society, and parents are compensated to the tune of 10 to 15% of the value of that. So it's not that I want government to put its thumb on the scales and intervene, it's just that we've done all these programs that take from the work that parents do to support everybody. And we have done, I almost used some of the nautical language we were discussing. We have done rather little to assist in that load. And so my argument isn't, gosh, we need to do social engineering to subsidize babies so people want and get more of them. It's people already want these. We should help them have what they want, because a society where people fundamentally fail to achieve basic life goals is not a free society. You might not know what the unfreedom is, but it's not free. It's some kind of not free if you cannot achieve basic, normal life goals. And 2, parents are paying vastly more than their fair share. On some level, what I'm really arguing for is not that we subsidize births to get births, but merely that we appropriately compensate parents.
Well, Lyman, thank you so much for coming to visit with us here in Charlottesville and for answering our questions. But this has been the Institute for Family Studies, and we've been looking at the future is family. Thank you, Lyman.